Welcome to Renegade Inc. A heady mix of precarious employment, stagnant wages, diminished opportunities, and a contracting economic pie has pushed many people to the limit. This means that how people experience the world is at odds with how politicians explain it. This mismatch creates fear and anger, and it's what the economists Eric Lonergan and Mark Blythecall Angrynomics. Joining me to discuss the economics of anger is the economist and author Eric Lonergan. Eric, welcome.
Thank you.
Sitting here in the middle of London,
Yeah.
throw a brick out of a window, it's going to hit someone who is angry. We are living in, and of course it'll hit them and they're angry because they've just been hit by a brick.
Yeah.
We're living in the age of anger. And not very many people would reject that idea. Why is everyone so livid?
Why is everyone so livid? I think people have always been livid. And this is the interesting thing about anger to some extent, is it's universal. Even children recognize anger. But we're very inarticulate when it comes to explaining what it is.
Why? Because we just say anger and it blankets one, it's just one thing?
Maybe because it's everywhere and we're so familiar with it. We've grown up having experienced it as human beings. For some reason, we've never really given it a lot of thought. And I speak absolutely for myself here. If you'd said to me, why do people get angry?
Yeah.
What are the different types of anger? Is there good anger? Is there bad anger? Okay. What should you do if somebody gets angry? I'm suddenly find myself completely inarticulate. And
was that a starting point for you because you hadn't actually got into this idea and started to break down, microaggression right through to rage, for instance, and none of this had been pigeonholed. So it was just this thing.
Well, the starting point for us was almost the opposite, which was, so Mark and I, Mark, the co-author, is a professor of political economy. We had a view about what was going on in the world as economists, political science. And one day we were trying to work out how to write it, and we were having conversations about it. And one day he just said, what about anger? What can we say about anger?
And was that a light bulb moment?
Absolutely. It just suddenly got the intellectual juices flowing, because we suddenly thought, God, that's fascinating. And we started reading about it. And the more you read, in a way, the more interesting it became, because it felt to me that I couldn't find anywhere where there was a synthesis. So there's work on neuroscience studying the angry brain. There's work in social psychology about children getting angry, groups getting angry. Moral philosophy dating all the way back to the Greeks about appropriate response to injustice. So you have all of this disparate literature, but nowhere does it really synthesize it and say, these are the 3-4 types. Everywhere it assumes we know what it is.
So what are the types? Because let's get into this.
Yeah, so the types is, there were a couple of key moments in the evolution. So the first one that was intriguing to us was the idea of anger that exists in moral philosophy. And this is Aristotle's idea, which is this is an appropriate response to an injustice. Right? And that's what most of the work historically that's been done on anger is all about. So something, and you witness an injustice, we seem to have a reaction that's of anger, a loss of temper, right? Which is kind of says, if you keep doing that, there's going to be consequences, right? We won't tolerate it.
Right.
And this is kind of ethical anger.
Right.
This is an appropriate response. And that is the anger of angels. We'll use this typology. Now then what we did is we did a data search of news stories. So we got Watson Analytics, big IBM program, to sort out through news stories, hundreds of thousands of news stories, sorted by anger, around the topic of anger. The second most frequent type of story was angry sports fans.
You shock me.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is the hilarious thing. Did you really need big data to conclude that? Like, anybody could have told you that. And this is one of the hilarious things about it is as soon as it's pointed out to you, you go, well, of course. And but then you say, well, why? Why is it that, and it's mainly men, spend good money on a weekend in their leisure time, often to travel to miserable parts of the country to watch a really rubbish game of football, to get furious?
You sell it so well.
Right, and yet we do. Yeah. And that was critical because we have these two faces of what we describe as public anger, the angel and the devil. And the angelic form is the moral outrage, is the kind of Black Lives Matter, witnessing an appalling injustice of police brutality. That's unacceptable. We're going to go outside and we're going to let people know that it has to stop. That's the kind of ethical regulator. And yet then we have this other sort of the angry fan who's a very curious phenomenon. So I started going to football matches and studying these angry fans. And the intriguing thing about them is we all expect them to be antagonistic towards the opposite side, but what's really interesting is when fights break out within the fan group. So they also regulate identity within their own.
Right.
And that's the key thing, is that anger as a fan seems to be this kind of tribal identity regulator. It's something about, I'm more loyal than you.
Why? Because I've supported the club for longer, I've got a bigger
Exactly.
tattoo.
I'm shouting louder, I'm singing more, don't sit down, stand up. You don't have enough commitment as a player. And of course the referee, let's just kill him. But in terms of, a lot of it is about, you were saying this before, it's about, as someone like Alex Ferguson, the Man United manager, you want to see that level of commitment. So this is so intriguing that this is about reinforcing our group identity.
Right.
Even if the basis of it is completely spurious. It's literally yellow shirt, red shirt. And I think you can't help but conclude that periodically, usually, and this is what's worrying about this tribal energy, it's a precursor to tribal violence. So if you look at the history of this in social and economic history, it is a precursor to violence. And if you go back to Greek and Roman times, tens of thousands of people could get killed at sporting events. I mean, sporting events could erupt into brutal, brutal violence. So it clearly serves some kind of a function, whether it's over scarcity or resources, but also there's a collective action problem, and here's where one does a bit of economics, which is, put it in English, is if you're going to go to war, you don't want to be at the front line.
Right.
Right? You need to send somebody else to the front line.
Right.
That's a collective action problem. We'd never fight wars because we'd always be saying, no, you go first. It'd be like a Monty Python sketch. So you need this little angry fan who goes around saying, no. Everybody get in line. You're all fighting.
With that tribalism, when you deploy that tribalism, are you saying that human beings by default, tribalism isn't very far away?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're there.
We are on the verge. This propensity to be tribal is always latent in human beings and very easy to trigger.
So when you get a leader that comes along, like just take Donald Trump, for instance, when he says, and you put it in the book, I am your voice.
Yeah.
And then you've got a Nigel Farage quote in there as well, saying, see the anger, see the rage.
Yeah.
What they're doing is channeling that tribalism to their own political ends.
Yeah, and Trump is particularly brilliant.
Why?
Like when you analyze anger and you look at the way he operates, because this very quickly becomes a political strategy. So what you realize is to win an election, most of the elections we're witnessing at the moment are being won by converting a minority. Right? So it's a majoritarian election, but it's tiny numbers of people are swinging the votes. Right? So you take Trump's election victory with 80,000 votes, so a fraction of 1% of the US population. Angry people are more likely to vote, so they may be a small number, but if you can trigger them,
you can get them there.
It motivates them.
And we will keep radical Islamic terrorists the hell out of our country. Another major part of our agenda is immigration security. We need to protect American jobs, security, and safety. We're going to build the wall. We have no choice. We have no choice. Build that wall, build that wall, build that wall, build that wall, build that wall.
Now he is well aware of the two types. I'm sure he can't articulate them, but he will go to the Rust Belt and make ethical arguments. Right? He will say, you've been neglected, your wages haven't grown, nobody listens to you in Washington. This is textbook moral philosophy, giving people a vote, representing their interests, the wrongdoing, the sense of wrongdoing. So he will absolutely tap into that sense of an injustice.
And when Clinton, for instance, came out and said basket of deplorables.
You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right?
That then absolutely puts him into the stratosphere, doesn't it? Because then there's more anger, because the supposed incumbent or the surefire winner, you can then direct more anger at that.
Well, it's a disaster strategy. If you think that our propensity, because what am I a deplorable? Right? If I am, then I'm against you. Right?
And now I'm angry.
Exactly.
Again.
What you should never do in any attempt to cooperate with other human beings is make your identity in opposition to theirs. And Trump, of course, was able to convince people who had, it's absurd when you think about it, how they could somehow perceive him to understand their plight. You're talking about people who had lost jobs in the industrial Rust Belt of America trying to identify with a property magnate from New York. Nothing in common. That's the success of saying we're on the same side.
A lot of our politics now, our partisan politics, is based on this notion of fear and threat. And so much of our biases are manipulated by politicians. So we see that in the US, in the UK, in India, these divides are laid down by politicians. They create this fear of anybody, an outsider who's not part of their group, coming in and taking their jobs or questioning the status quo or impinging on their rights in any way. And we know from research that our biases are more activated, our prejudices, when we are being fearful or we are feeling under threat, because we feel like we have these limited resources to compete against, and anybody who's not part of our group is somebody to be feared, a threat to these resources. So politicians actually play on this, that by creating this fear of anybody who's an outsider. And we see that more in communities which are not diverse, which are more isolated, which are more secluded. And so they get these become these silos where these views are being echoed back again and again.
I guess that the next level question one should ask oneself is, why is this happening now? Why has politics become about triggering these identities and getting motivation through tribalism, given that tribalism has always been there? And I think one of the other interesting dimensions is in a sense, what happened after the Cold War. So during the Cold War, we had very clear political identities. You know, your representatives came from a part of the country like you, maybe you shared an accent with them, they represented your social economic status, they represented your interests. It was a battle of ideas.
Yes.
You know, are you left-wing or right-wing? Are you pro-state or pro-the market? With neoliberalism, for want of a better term, you have this kind of consensus in the middle. And I think, a lot of people started to feel unrepresented. Right. There was nothing to motivate me in politics. Right? It's all dull, it's technocrats, it's different suits arguing with each other over trivia. So everybody becomes disenfranchised.
But then also there's the triumphalism of the market, neoliberalism, winning supreme.
Yeah.
Inequality starts to take off, and then you get a massive disparity.
Yeah.
Don't you? And the so-called deplorables are the people who are on the economic scrap heap, and then there's the 1%.
Absolutely. So the thing is that when people actually sat back and assessed it, there were no motivating political ideas, or the politics became motiveless, and yet we had huge problems. We've got a huge environmental problem, we've got a huge problem with inequality, we've got problems with child poverty, we've got stress and anxiety in people's lives with mental illness, in the developed world. So we've got global and national problems, and yet politics has become talking heads arguing over one variant of a policy versus another. Then in come the Farages, the Trumps. You think of the Italian populists, the five-star movements, the indignatos. All of this is ripe for political populists to tap into these more primitive motivators like tribal rage.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc. Before we talk more about why everyone is livid with the economist and author Eric Lonergan, let's have a look at what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc. Index. First up from Dragster, neoliberalism leads straight to fascism. No surprise, the legitimate anger and loss of control that people feel due to stagnant wages and lobbyists running the EU show the right is able to weaponise this. The right has used this, hasn't it? Because people feel disenfranchised, so they can be exploited.
Yeah, I mean, tribalism I think is being exploited by populists from both left and right. And the only way to counter it is to refer to what Dragster's getting at here, which is legitimate anger, is tap into a genuine sense of injustice and convert it into something positive.
Next from Bloomberg Economics, the economic gauge known as the misery index is expected to be at a high in November, posing a significant threat to Trump's re-election. Would you argue the opposite? Because if the misery index is high, there'll be more anger, therefore there'll be more votes for him.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's an interesting question here about whether the incumbent suffers because he's deemed to be held responsible. And I think the response to the political class's treatment of COVID, I think, is going to be a big question. And it may make him very vulnerable. I have to say, I think that would be a good thing.
And finally, from Stephen Pimentel, one could be forgiven for imagining that Trump is a false flag thrown to discredit opposition to neoliberalism. Come on, that's beautifully conspiratorial. The neoliberals put him in.
He's a double bluff.
Yeah.
He's definitely a flag waver. And beware flag wavers.
Our book of the week this week, Angrynomics by Eric Lonergan and Mark Blythe. Eric, pitch it to us.
Right, so 2 types of anger are ruling the world. You should really know what they are.
Sold. I'm buying it. So to recap that first half, 2 types of anger.
Yeah.
What are they?
They're moral outrage, which everybody understands, which is what we teach children, why we get cross with them if they don't do as they don't treat people appropriately. And then there is tribal rage, the angry sports fan.
So as an economist, you've identified this. Now bring it to the political and economic realm.
So those 2 types really are relevant to understanding what's happening in politics globally. Probably the best, most articulate populist is Viktor Orban in Hungary.
Right.
And Orban explains very, very clearly what his political strategy is. And what he's really saying is that Viktor Orban, by way of background, was a part of the student movement against communism. So should be the greatest advocate of free markets and liberalism. But he pretty much says free markets and liberalism don't win you elections. Right. What wins you elections are issues of national identity, social conservatism, motivating people around these instincts that they care about deeply. And that's what's happening with our politics. So our political class, in order to win elections, combined with the power of the media, is trying to exploit these 2 types of anger to win elections. Politics outside of the populace, what is it trying to achieve? What is it going to do to change our lives? I can't answer those questions. Right. If you said to me, what is Macron, who's the kind of successful centrist, largely successful, I should say, because the turnout was so low in the presidential election, right? So you ask, what does he stand for? What is he going to do? Is he going to change French people's lives? No.
Could the average French person tell you?
No.
Right.
And that is a major problem.
That's the problem, isn't it?
That's the problem right
Because
there.
in that void, if you come to the Gramsci idea that it's an interregnum and that's where monsters can be born.
Absolutely.
The old hasn't died, the new can't be born.
Yeah.
This is the time of monsters. That's when you start to get the nationalism, which ultimately leads to the fascism, and we all know how that ends.
Yeah, I mean, you see it very, very clearly, the role that the angry fan and tribalism serves. It is a precursor to war. Right, so it's an extremely dangerous thing to unleash. War isn't top of my list of worries. I think the economic environment deeply disturbs me. Right?
So on your worry list, war isn't top, but it's maybe top 5. How close to the top is the lack of ambition, creativity, and just common sense of the current crop of politicians?
Well, I'm hopeful because I think there is a coalescence of the broad population around 3 sort of self-evident objectives. I mean, so the first one is the environment, and so this to me is a huge opportunity, right? Because we're in societies where the biggest economic problem seems to be, supposedly, is the fact that interest rates are close to 0. Right? We've all heard this. If you've read anything about it, you go, oh my God, what are we going to do? And you go, well, that's fantastic, because that means the state, any investment that the state does, it can finance. Right. And we have this huge need for investment spending. So we should absolutely, but no one is making this case that says, take the UK, there are 3 things that we can do to dramatically transform the sustainability of our economic activity. And we will show the rest of the world how to do it. And we're going to do it in 5 years. Let's do it. Let's have a 5-year objective for 0 carbon emissions.
Yeah.
And we're going to get as near as damn it to it. Why can't we have 90% of energy is sustainable? You could easily do that within 5 years.
Especially given the fact that we're now bailing out all these businesses.
Absolutely.
So you put the caveats in to say, we've got to be here, by then, that's it.
But also bear in mind, think of it like this. If you can borrow as a state for 20 years at a negative real interest rate, that means the private sector is paying you to take out money. Any positive return that you can make on any investment is worth doing.
No-brainer.
It's a no-brainer. This needs to happen. And then if people have a vested ownership, they can see their society improving and being changed. That's a motivating politics. Somebody who delivers that to them, they will vote for.
Is that the right channel to go through, politics? Because I've thought about this a lot and often see that most change, social change, starts in the arts, it starts in creativity, it starts in entrepreneurship, it starts in fringe movements. It doesn't start in the political realm. The political realm then come along afterwards and legislate and all the rest of it. Do you need both things?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you take the green movement environmental sustainability of the planet, that hasn't been led by Bullitt. They followed.
Right.
You're absolutely right. And I think the work has been done. The only thing is it's very difficult to have a really interesting play, piece of theatre, piece of cinema, pop song about dual interest rates. Right? I mean, so unfortunately, you do need the economists who say, you've created the motivation, you've told us the problem, you've got people out there protesting, but now we need a fix.
So you don't think Stormzy can rap about
I mean, Stormzy probably could.
QE.
But you do need the mechanic at the end of the day to help. And that's where I think...
Okay, so where do you put your effort? Where do you put your effort?
Well, me personally is in the mechanics. So I think I look at the economic system and I go, this is where we need to get to. How can we come up with non-partisan, highly effective, simple ideas? And the good side to nationalism, I think, is, this is again an idea of the Greeks, is Aristotle again says the opposite of anger is play, which is such a clever idea because it's not a straightforward opposite, but we all know it's the antithesis of anger is play. And the playfulness in the world at the moment is that you have so many countries of the same problem. And this reversion to the nation state, it's like lots of little experiments. Now, if one country shows us how to do it, everybody else will copy. And we don't like doing unconventional things because they're risky, but if somebody else has done it, suddenly the risk switches and you go, well, hang on a minute, if Norway did it and it's working, why aren't we doing it?
So give us some action points. What do we do?
Right, so we need a really quick, simple solution to wealth inequality.
Yeah, what is it?
And the solution there is actually for the state to buy assets on our behalf. So let me give you a really simple example. UK government borrows for 20 years at close to zero interest rate.
Yep.
If it went out tomorrow and it issued 20-year debt at zero interest rate, zero coupon, which means we only repay it in 20 years, takes those proceeds and sets up the equivalent of an endowment, like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund or the Wellcome Trust or charities. We have hundreds of institutions globally, and says, I want you to generate me a 4 to 6% return. Right? Compound interest, apologies, this will be the only maths that we use, says they'll be in 15 years' time, they'll be able to repay the debt and have the assets. Because one asset is compounding like that, and the other one is compounding, and the liability is zero. Yeah? So, and what you could do is, you could do this within 6 months, you could set this up, and you could say to 50% of the UK population who have very few assets, you're going to have a stake in this.
Right.
So you have a housing fund, a healthcare fund, an education, you have an inheritance, and it will be compounding away, and we will be the custodians of it. And we will do this for each generation.
Sold. Next one.
Next one is, we supposedly have a problem with the fact that monetary policy has run out of steam, right? Interest rates are zero.
Yeah.
People worry about the fact that we can't get mortgages lower, it starts to affect savers. What are we going to do? There's a really, really simple solution here, which is what central banks have started to do is they've done what's called targeted lending. So we've hit zero interest rates, so we're not going to change interest rates anymore. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a separate lending facility, which we're going to set at a negative interest rate, right? But we're going to, and the banks will lend it to you, but we're going to designate what function it serves, okay? So the central banks, clearly we need more stimulus in the economy. We're in a recession, we face deflation, we need to get a boost to the economy. How do we do it? Central banks come out and say, we're going to do 5 to 10% of GDP. We're going to make the loans available at minus 3%, fixed for 5 years, but you have to do sustainable investment spending.
How do you get them to do it?
Oh, I mean, to be honest, if you offer that to the private sector now, you can get virtually a guaranteed return from, for example, a wind farm. The state controls the price of electricity through the regulator. You just guarantee me a 3% real return, lend to me at -1, done.
Okay, so
and you'll have a boom in energy investment. Deflation is actually a huge opportunity for a modern functioning state.
I haven't heard anyone say that.
Yeah.
Because people are terrified of it because they look at the history books.
Well, it's terrified if you leave it unchecked.
Right.
But what it actually means is you can print money.
Would you write off the private debt?
Well, I think you could. I think ultimately, yes. I mean, ultimately, I think private sector debt levels are too high and we need inflation to erode them. But I think we can do that over a 20 or 30-year view.
Okay.
Yeah.
Third.
Okay, third is, I don't want recessions to cause any more human misery, right? I went into economics with the sole objective to see the end of that was the intellectual challenge for me was how can we stop recessions from happening? If you look at human history, recessions are a disaster. They cause child poverty, unemployment. They are disastrous.
And we're now looking at a depression.
And we're in a depression at the moment, and people are hanging on. You know, just about hanging in there. And if this continues for 3 to 6 months, people lose their jobs, or longer, it will be a disaster. How do we end it? This comes back to the zero interest rates. We need, really, really simple, central banks have the ability to transfer cash into the bank accounts of all adult citizens. Use your banks to serve the function, and literally the central bank, instead of messing around with interest rates, can come in next week and press a button, and every adult citizen in the UK or the EU and the United States gets $1,000, £1,000, €1,000 credited to their account. And you do that until your economy is recovering. In fact, you could do that until there's full employment. The only reason we don't do it is that central banks were set up in the 17 and 1800s, and they were set up to finance governments and to provide liquidity for banks. It's an accident of institutional history.
Man, woman on the street listening to this, let's bring it back to what we can do, because you know, all that from an economist, which you explain brilliantly, just can be overwhelming. Because I just feel so helpless. Just give me some solutions and let me do something. For sure. Solutions.
Well, so the solutions are that don't think of a sustainable, don't think of the environmental crisis as a crisis. It's a huge opportunity. Okay. The story that you want to be listening into, the arguments we want to be making, the debates we want to be having are, how do we solve this in a way that creates jobs, improves our cities, improves the distribution of conditions and circumstances across our society.
Fantastic.
And we can do that.
And so suddenly you've changed the language and the problems become the opportunity.
And they are. I mean, I'm not just saying that. They genuinely are. We need to have better jobs, more investment spending, a better environment, more regional growth. Those are all things that we need, and we have absolutely got the opportunity to do it.
And back to the football match, what do you say to those fellas who say to you on a Saturday afternoon, mate, it's too optimistic?
Well, what I'd say to the football fans is just remember it's fine for football, okay? But we need to leave the tribal rage in the football stadium. Don't take it into politics. I think collectively we need to be alert to this because we're all being manipulated. Our propensity to form tribes is so hardwired that it even happens to us inadvertently.
Congratulations on the book, and also congratulations to Mark Blythe, your co-author. Really vital, especially now.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for your time.
Not at all.
That's it from Renegade Inc. this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us at Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.